Welcome to War Stories 24, where history bleeds, bravery breathes, and the past lives again. Today, we take you deep into the trenches of the First World War for a true stories that will leave you breathless. Story 1. October 2nd, 1918, the Argonne Forest, France. The forest was thick, almost jungle-like, and crawling with German machine guns. Rain poured endlessly, soaking boots, rusting rifles. In this haunted wood, over 550 American soldiers from the 77th Infantry Division were sent on a mission, one they were never supposed to return from. Their orders were simple yet deadly. Push forward through enemy lines, take Hill 198 and hold it no matter what. Leading the charge was Major Charles Whittlesey, a bookish lawyer-turned-soldier from New York whose bravery would soon become legend. Part 1. Into the forest. As dawn broke, the 1st and 2nd Battalions began their advance, weaving through trees, ducking under fire, determined to take the high ground. The Germans had dug in well, with snipers in trees and Maxim guns hidden behind logs. But the Americans kept pushing. By nightfall, Whittlesey and roughly 550 men had reached their objective. Victory not quite. They soon realized they were completely surrounded. Their flanks hadn't moved up. Communication lines were severed. No food. No water, no reinforcements. They weren't just behind enemy lines. They were trapped. Part 2, Hell on Hill 198. The next 5 days became a living nightmare. The Germans encircled them, launching attack after attack. Machine guns raked the hill. Artillery shook the trees. Gas seeped through the leaves. Men dropped one by one. Worse, friendly fire rained down from their own side. Artillery meant for the Germans was hitting the very hill the Americans were on. Desperate, Whittlesey sent a message tied to a homing pigeon. "Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." The bird's name was Cher Ami, a small pigeon that would change the fate of the battalion. Cher Ami flew through gunfire, shrapnel, and smoke, her legs shattered, eye blinded, chest torn. But she delivered the message. The shelling stopped, but the battle raged on. Part 3. No food. No water, no hope. Days passed. Men ate bark, they drank from puddles. Infection spread through open wounds. Supplies were gone. Ammunition was running out. But Whittlesey refused to surrender. When a German officer sent word offering to accept their surrender, Whittlesey didn't even respond. He stood up, brushed the dirt off his uniform, and turned away. That silent defiance became a symbol of American resistance. Under his leadership, soldiers dug deeper trenches, rationed bullets, and fought off German charges with bayonets and fists. One private wrote in his diary, "The ground is soaked in blood. Every night I expect it to be my last. But somehow we keep fighting. We are ghosts holding this hill." Part 4. The final stand. On the 5th day, the Germans launched their biggest assault. They came with flamethrowers, grenades, and mortars. The Americans were nearly out of bullets. Some grabbed the rifles of the dead. Others charged with knives. They fought like cornered lions. And then, finally, trumpets. American reinforcements broke through the German line. The siege was over. Of the original 550 men, only 194 walked out alive. They were emaciated, wounded, exhausted, but they were heroes. Part 5. Aftermath and Glory. Major Whittlesey was awarded the Medal of Honor along with several others. Cher Ami, the pigeon, received France's Croix de Guerre and is now displayed in the Smithsonian. The story of the Lost Battalion became legendary. Whittlesey, despite his heroism, would struggle with survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. He once said, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but doing one's duty in spite of it."
Story 2, it was 1918, and the world was at war. The trenches of northern France were soaked in blood and mud, filled with the cries of the wounded and the relentless thunder of artillery. In the chaos of the Battle of Marcoing, British forces were locked in a brutal push against the German line. Leading the charge with the 5th Duke of Wellington's regiment was a quiet but fierce private named Henry Tandy. By then, Tandy was already a battle-hardened soldier. He had seen the horrors of Ypres and survived the nightmare of Passchendaele. But on that day in Marcoing, he would do something few soldiers would dare attempt: run toward the wounded while bullets filled the air. As the British advanced, machine guns opened fire from hidden positions. Men fell screaming into the mud. No man's land turned into a death trap. But through the haze of gunfire, one man broke from cover. Not to fight, but to rescue. Henry Tandy darted through machine gun fire to reach the fallen, dragging them, carrying them, sometimes crawling through blood and barbed wire. He brought them back to the safety of the trenches. Once, twice, 10 times. 20. More than 30 wounded soldiers were saved by his hands in a single day. He didn't wear medical gear. He had no orders to do it. But when his comrades were crying out in pain, Tandy didn't hesitate. His officers were stunned. One even ordered him to stop, for his own safety. Tandy replied, "If I were lying out there, they'd come for me." Later that same day, a German counterattack struck hard. Many British troops were forced to fall back, but Tandy stayed. With just a rifle and unwavering grit, he held the line by himself for precious minutes, firing, reloading, and fighting off the enemy long enough for reinforcements to arrive. One soldier, standing between his wounded brothers and certain death. And in the middle of all this madness, something remarkable happened. Amid the smoke and screams, Tandy came across a wounded enemy soldier stumbling through the debris. The man was unarmed, bloodied, terrified. Tandy raised his rifle and lowered it. He let the soldier go, not because of orders, not because of rules, but because, even after all the death and chaos, Henry Tandy hadn't lost his humanity. It was war, but he still saw the man, not just the uniform. That night, as silence fell over the battlefield, the men he had saved lay breathing, thanks to his relentless courage. And those who watched him knew they had witnessed something rare, not just a brave soldier, but a good man. For his actions that day, Tandy was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the British Empire. He had already earned the Distinguished Conduct Medal and the Military Medal in previous battles. He became the most decorated private soldier of the entire war. Yet despite all the honors, Tandy never bragged. He rarely even spoke about the war. When asked, he simply said, "I did what needed to be done." After the war, he returned to England and lived quietly. He worked at a hospital, no longer carrying wounded from the battlefield, but helping them recover in peace. He never sought fame, never chased glory. Even as his name entered history books, Henry Tandy remained humble, a quiet giant among men. He passed away in 1977 at the age of 86. Buried with full military honors, his medals are now displayed in the Regimental Museum, reminders of a soldier who fought with heart, not just with a weapon. In a war defined by cruelty, Tandy stood for something else: compassion, duty, and quiet strength. He didn't win wars with strategy. He didn't give speeches or lead battalions. But he saved lives, held the line, and walked away from the battlefield with dignity intact. Henry Tandy was a warrior, a rescuer, a reluctant hero. And sometimes history is shaped not by those who take lives, but by those who choose to save them. Story 3, April 1917, Vimy Ridge, France. The air was bitter cold. The sky was steel gray. The mud swallowed boots with every step, and death hung in the silence before the guns. The Canadians had been tasked with an impossible mission: take the heavily fortified German positions on Vimy Ridge. The French had tried, the British had failed. But now the Canadians would attempt what no one else could do. Among them were two best friends from Nova Scotia, Private James Archer and Private William McCrae. They weren't brothers by blood, but you couldn't tell them that. They had grown up together, enlisted together, and now they stood shoulder to shoulder in a trench carved into the side of a bloody hill. They were both just 20 years old. Their battalion was to charge at dawn. The enemy had the high ground, thick barbed wire, bunkers with mounted machine guns, and endless artillery. Everyone in that trench knew the odds. Most of them wrote final letters home that night. But not James and William. Instead, they sat in the dark and made a pact. "If one of us doesn't make it," William said, "the other finishes the fight." James nodded. "Always." Then the whistles blew. The assault began at first light. The earth erupted with artillery. The Canadians surged forward under the cover of a creeping barrage just ahead of their own shells. Bullets cut through the morning fog. Screams pierced the air. Barbed wire shredded boots and bodies alike. But James and William ran. Together, side by side. They pushed through mud and fire, crawling under wire, jumping over shell holes, charging through the smoke. And then William was hit. A bullet tore through his shoulder. He dropped hard into the mud. James didn't stop. He couldn't. The officers screamed to keep moving, and so he did, firing, ducking, climbing. But every step forward ripped him apart inside. By mid-morning, James and his company had taken the first bunker. Smoke billowed behind them. The cost was brutal. Bodies lay in heaps, and James turned back against orders. Against logic, he turned back. He grabbed a spare canteen and sprinted down the ridge, retracing his path through bullet-riddled dirt, fire still crackling all around. He found William slumped beside a crater, barely conscious, bleeding fast. James dropped beside him, tore strips from his uniform, and pressed them against the wound. "You idiot," William gasped. "You came back?" James smiled through gritted teeth. "Always." What followed was a miracle of will. James dragged William through a mile of open terrain under fire, sometimes crawling, sometimes pulling him over his shoulders. He was shot in the leg halfway through the journey, but he didn't stop. Shells exploded feet away. Snipers took aim. He moved anyway. By dusk, both boys collapsed just outside the medical trench, barely alive. But alive. The medics were stunned. Not just because James had survived, but because he'd refused to leave his friend behind. They were rushed to a field hospital. James spent 2 weeks recovering. William's shoulder would never fully heal, but he survived. When asked why he risked it all, James simply said, "We made a promise." 2 weeks later, James returned to the front. He went on to fight at Hill 70 in Passchendaele, earning the military medal for bravery. William was discharged due to injury and sent back to Nova Scotia, where he waited for his friend to come home. They worked, raised families, and stayed in touch every year, writing on April 9th, the anniversary of Vimy Ridge. James never liked telling the story. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come back, but those who knew him said he carried the weight of that war every single day. At his funeral in 1963, William stood by his grave, now an old man with a cane, and said just one thing. He kept his promise. The story of the Trench Brothers of Vimy Ridge is not in most history books, but it lives in the quiet courage of every soldier who chooses loyalty over orders and love over fear. They weren't generals. They didn't command armies. But in the middle of one of the war's bloodiest battles, they proved that bravery isn't about medals. It's about never giving up on your brother. For more real stories of sacrifice and honor, subscribe to War Stories 24. Because sometimes the greatest battles are fought not for victory, but for each other.